Let's talk about the assisted dying bill. Kim Leadbeater's bill is still going through Parliament. It's been through the committee stage. It's currently being amended. One of the big news items this week is that the requirement to have a High Court judge sign off on the permission for an assisted death is quietly being dropped and being replaced with an expert panel. I thought what was interesting about this is that Leadbeater is calling this Judge Plus, even though it's actually removing the role of a judge. Now, obviously, we don't think so highly of the role of judges, but it is something that swayed a lot of MPs into backing the bill on its second reading. It was what made a lot of MPs think that it would have proper safeguards to prevent people from being coerced, for instance, into an assisted suicide when they shouldn't be. So, Luke, what do you make of this change and what it says about this process?
I think it was always a completely unrealistic safeguard to begin with.
Yeah.
I think everyone who looked at it said, how is a High Court judge going to process and deal with these incredibly difficult questions at the scale that will be required, on the time scale that will be required? So you have this requirement that someone has got 6 months left to live, and anyone who knows anything about the High Court knows it takes twice as long to get a case resolved.
Yeah.
So I had a hypothetical example at the time, which was, imagine if an application comes before the High Court, and the argument on one side is this person is perfectly fit to make this decision and fulfills the medical criteria, but there is concern in the judge's mind that they're actually being coerced. Let's take that hypothetical example. Well, one, coercing someone to commit suicide or to have assisted dying is a criminal offence.
Yeah.
And would be a criminal offence under the Leadbeater bill. And that was another purported safeguard. So does the judge say, go away, I need to investigate the possible criminal offence that's happening right in front of my eyes? Does he does he have power to make his own inquiries? Does he refer the matter to the police? Whatever he does, it's going to take a lot longer than 6 months.
Yeah.
So anyone with any experience of how these courts work saw this was never going to happen. And so what's happened is that the panel is now taking place, this creepy panel that's going to be populated by 3 people who probably have their own sympathy with the prospect of assisted dying. In other words, you're going to have a panel full of people that broadly probably agree, because why else would you sit on a panel to consider these cases if you didn't broadly have sympathy with it? And the same situation arises. How can you possibly hope that for this panel to give any kind of scrutiny to a detailed and complex moral question like this when the person has 6 months left to live?
Yeah.
And really what's going on is that the safeguards are just being dialed down and dialed down and dialed down, such that if this panel is seriously going to be if this is going to be part of the picture, the next stage is to make the panel's considerations more streamlined, to gloss over any potential issues. There is no hope that a panel like this could deal with the kind of complexities that these cases raise, and I think that's extremely worrying.
And Tom, I mean, people often warn about the slippery slope in relation to assisted dying. We've seen in places like Canada how quickly it expands the criteria, once it's been legalised. We're seeing the slippery slope before it's even been legalised.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think it's because of the fact that there was a lot of overclaiming on the basis of this bill. It was always framed from the off as an argument about safeguards, effectively, which I think the pro-bill side of the argument maybe starting to realise was they weren't onto a winner with that. Partly because of the fact that many of the safeguards they were proposing, and it's worth stressing that this High Court judge part of it, even though it was always quite clearly impractical as much as anything else, was central to their claim that this would be the safest piece of assisted dying, to use the jargon, legislation in the world.
Yeah.
There's about 60 MPs who are pretty much on record as saying that was the one reason why they were willing to vote for it at the initial stage. And it's only got about a 55 MP majority, so these numbers are pretty significant. And yet it's been peeled away so quickly. I think some people are within their rights to wonder whether or not it was a fig leaf to begin with.
Yeah.
We're in a situation in which there's already vast questions being asked about the ability of, on the one hand, the health service to be able to dispense adequate care, let alone there being this whole new area of essentially death care being offered. Similarly, a lot of important concerns being raised about the fact that how can you even really have anything resembling a supposedly free choice about a state-assisted death in a situation where there isn't adequate end-of-life or hospice provision. And that's something which the bill has not dealt with adequately whatsoever. And then you've got the legal aspect. We're constantly talking about how clogged up and sclerotic our court system already is. The idea that you'd have this whole area which would be brought under its purview as well was always for the birds. So I think some people are within their rights to question whether or not the drafters of this bill maybe always saw this day coming. But I think we've made this point before, but I think that the focus on safeguards is revealing because of the fact that it's impossible to mitigate against a slippery slope. Everywhere this has been tried, pretty much, the supposed limits placed on the criteria for assisted dying have been loosened up pretty quickly. There's the Canada example where it's gone from a setup which more or less resembles what's being proposed here, 6 months to live, end of life being reasonably foreseeable, to a situation in which disabled veterans are applying for a stair lift and they get offered assisted suicide instead.
Yeah.
That's happened in the space of about 10 years, but even in Oregon, which is often held up by Kim Leadbeater as the kind of model, that's still a situation in which people who, for instance, suffering from anorexia have been able to access state-assisted death as a consequence. And Kim Leadbeater has been very cagey and unable to give a straight answer on the fact that as it's currently drafted, many people believe that is precisely what would also happen under this legislation, because someone's anorexia could be deemed so serious that it is essentially a form of terminal illness. So the focus on safeguard, I think, is revealing. It's kind of put them on the back foot in a way from the very beginning, but it also, I think, underlines the fact that you cannot make this process safe. It's the sort of thing where unless you have, nowhere has it been tried to the point where you can mitigate against these grim circumstances and individual cases arising, because of the fact that fundamentally it's not something that you, as soon as you cross that Rubicon, in which people can access this kind of thing, it's basically impossible to mitigate against concerns about coercion, people being in the right frame of mind, what have you, because nowhere has that been achieved so far.
And one of the things that's really struck me throughout this process is just how Orwellian some of the language is around it. I mean, we've had Kim Leadbeater calling it Judge Plus when she's talking about removing a judge. We've had one of the witnesses during the committee stage from New South Wales talked about how assisted suicide was actually a form of suicide prevention, because it meant that people were not, throwing themselves off bridges or hanging themselves or whatever it might be. Just completely bizarre, as if the end result isn't suicide. Also, there's a real touchiness with Leadbeater and other supporters of the bill around using that word suicide. Even though it's a bill that would amend the Suicide Act, people have been told off for that kind of thing. Look, do you think, is it necessary almost to manipulate language in order to get this over the line? Because it is actually very creepy and very scary what is being proposed.
Yeah, I think the need to regulate language comes from the fact that people want to ignore that this bill would fundamentally change the relationship between the state and death and life. Doctors would go from protecting life at all costs to offering an alternative to that, and that is the fundamental philosophical change that would be brought about by this bill. So all the talk, I think Tom's right, all the talk around safeguards, around judges, around the safety of the legislation, it ignores the biggest danger, which is the philosophical shift that underpins the whole movement. Once you change that relationship, you can't put the genie back in the bottle. Vulnerable people will be made subject to this change. They will be the ones at the heart of this change. And I just go back to the question of how you could possibly, if you are serious about safeguards, how do you possibly expect a panel, a judge, or anyone to get to the bottom of what is behind the cases that come before them? How do they find out what is going on in the quiet rooms of these families, in the hushed conversations between vulnerable people and their family? How can you get to the bottom of what is going on in a vulnerable person's mind? How do you get to the bottom of how that change affects the way people feel about their own lives?
Yeah.
All of these are changes that you can't control with safeguards, with law. And it's that kind of philosophical shift that is arguably the most dangerous element of the bill.
And even if you could somehow arrive at this utopia where every case could be investigated as vigorously as people might feel comfortable with, even if we're in a situation where hospice care and end-of-life care and palliative care, whatever you want to call it, is wonderfully provided, and that that's not necessarily it has to be a consideration in terms of costs or in terms of what people might experience in their kind of final few months of life. Take that out of the equation, you're still left with that fundamental problem, which is changing, as you say, Luke, the state's relationship with death, the fact that it would create these kind of two categories of citizens, those whose suicide we try desperately to prevent, and this other group over here whose lives we deem to be sufficiently wretched that we should, if anything, facilitate their suicide and to aid it in taking place. And what that naturally kind of changes the state's relationship and society's relationship with disabled people, with vulnerable people, with elderly people. It also, in quite a concerning, sinister way, I think kind of changes our relationship with suicide as something that there should be so much focus on preventing, seen as something that people really do not want to happen, rather than something that is, as we say, facilitated. And in a strange kind of way, I think the only people who've been kind of consistent on this are the couple of Reform MPs who back both assisted dying in principle and the death penalty. That's two positions which I disagree with on both cases, but at least there's a consistency in that. But interestingly, even they have now said that they're not going to back this legislation because of the safeguards falling away. But always at the core of this was that principled debate, and I think it's been telling that through the discussion of safeguards, through the discussion of how complex the process is, and the constant appeals to expertise being a way in which you can mitigate against any potential downfalls from this legislation, has been a way that the pro-bill side have tried to evade that much more profound conversation, because I think once you have it, people start to realise what a sinister road that we'd be going down.